Hi everyone, and welcome to Genocide Education, Week 3, on Difficult Knowledge. As usual, here are this week's learning objectives. Okay, let's start with this famous image, which is where our Reading 1 this week begins. This is a famous photograph of a young Sudanese child during a Civil War-induced famine. 3 months after this photo was published in the New York Times, the photographer committed suicide, just a week after winning the Pulitzer Prize for this very photograph. Talk about disturbing. Here's a far less famous, more, dare I say, banal photograph, which speaks to the author's rhetorical question on the opening of Reading 1. How many of you have walked by a homeless person in the last month and done nothing? I mean, you can surely count me for one. To the extent that these images make us uncomfortable, that they are so unsettling that they may compel us to avert our eyes, or make us want to look away from such disturbing things, they're examples of difficult knowledge. The concept of difficult knowledge was originally coined to signify how social traumas are represented in teaching and learning, as well as how individuals encounter such traumas through pedagogy. Trauma is our normal means of relating present suffering to past violence. Trauma is the historical residue of violence. It's not the experience of violence itself, per se, but rather what comes in the wake of that experience. It's very much after the fact. Although originally designed for an individual level of analysis, the trauma concept has expanded to include collectivities. Collective trauma thus goes beyond the specific psychiatric diagnostic criteria applied in clinical settings, and speaks to the larger intergenerational consequences of social suffering of all forms, including genocide, mass atrocities, and slavery. So what happens when you bring these collective traumas into the classroom? That's where the concept of difficult knowledge comes into play. The concept was coined by this Canadian psychoanalyst to explore how students' inner conflicts disrupt learning histories of hatred, aggression, and suffering. Central to the difficulty of learning about traumatic histories is experiencing the limits of the self through encounters with the suffering of others. Even for students who may, thankfully, or God willing, never experience the reality of genocide or mass violence, their encounters with the traumatic experiences of others may nevertheless upset their worldview or assumptions, such as the belief in the justness of society or the goodness of humanity. What is particularly difficult or unsettling about such traumatic encounters is that they are resistant to ever becoming, quote-unquote, settled history, as if any historical meaning could ever be set in stone, once and for all. But that's especially impossible for traumatic histories, because by definition, trauma resists closure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I can look back at my own personal experiences with trauma on an individual level, and I can thankfully see the silver lining. The problem is that unresolved collective trauma can fuel conflict and resentment, which in turn can lead to the conditions that enable genocide. But before we get to that, however, let's first talk some more about psychoanalysis as a methodology in teacher education. Psychoanalysis is at once a distinct intellectual discipline, a theory of the human mind and human body, and a kind of therapeutic practice. We're only concerned with a theoretical aspect, which is especially noteworthy for its discovery and exploration of the unconscious, referring to the many different mental operations that greatly influence our emotions and behavior, but which occur below the level of our awareness of ordinary consciousness. Psychoanalysis and the discovery of the unconscious has had a significant impact on other disciplines, such as sociology and anthropology. In fact, the unconscious is much more social than the common sense and pop cultural notion of the unconscious, which is kind of like this imaginary scenario of the person inside the person secretly telling us what to do, like the Pixar film Inside Out. No, the unconscious is not so insular. It's very much a product of the world around us, our social environments. Indeed, it's been argued that the unconscious is essentially linguistic in nature and functions like a language according to its own rules and grammar. Now, this also relates to the concept of intersubjectivity, which is the interface between what goes on in the depths of our minds and what goes on in the world around us, in our social lives. As cultural anthropologists might describe it, intersubjectivity involves the production of common knowledge and beliefs, shared systems of meaning that are transmitted via symbols, especially but not exclusively through language. It's this socially mediated content, these systems of meaning, that provide a lot of the stuff of our unconscious. Yet another way to think about this interface is through the sociology of knowledge, which is a branch of the social sciences that shows how systems of meaning and modes of thinking are context-dependent. Our knowledge of reality is socially constructed, and it very much depends on our standpoint. This is true even in the natural sciences or mathematics, to the extent that such disciplines are filtered through human languages. Anyways, one of our recommended readings this week deploys a sociology of knowledge to understand the Armenian genocide, or rather, to understand how we know about genocide at all. I'll come back to that historical case momentarily, but what's noteworthy about this approach is that it isn't necessarily concerned with knowledge in the strict sense of the word, as in a veridical correspondence with reality. Rather, from a constructivist perspective, the sociology of knowledge approach is concerned with how certain assumptions about the world come to be so deeply ingrained and taken for granted. Knowledge obtains this level of widespread social acceptance through a process of sedimentation, in which meaning, such as the historical meaning of a nation's ignominious past, becomes settled once and for all. Of course, it's never so simple. Historical meaning can never be quote-unquote settled. It's always contested. This is especially evident in cases of genocide denial. Here, for example, you see an image of Armenian Americans protesting against Turkish denialism. This image encapsulates the highly contested stakes of collective memory. Now, collective memory is so highly contested because it serves such an important function in society. And just like I said on the previous slide, with regard to the intersubjective dimension to the unconscious, memory is also an inherently social practice, to the extent that it is often filtered through symbols, including but not limited to language. Such a theory of collective memory dates back to an early 20th century body of scholarship known as functionalism, which used the human body as an analogy for defining society as a system of interrelated, interdependent parts. According to this paradigm, collective memory serves several important functions in helping to integrate society, much like the brain drives the human body. Individuals are thus said to acquire a sense of self or social identity through socialization, or the process by which an individual becomes part of a group. Socialization is impossible without collective memory, which provides a repertoire of stories, myths, and legends that effectively demarcate the in-group from other out-groups. Yet many of these stories, myths, and legends also function to obscure, silence, or deny those parts of history that don't fit into the neat, integrative script of collective memory. Along these lines, there's yet another, more contemporary body of sociology that examines denialism in the same context as collective memory. Denialism has thus been described as denial writ large, when an entire segment of society turns in favor of a more comfortable lie. It's noteworthy that both victims and perpetrators may silence the past. The aforementioned recommended reading this week about the Armenian genocide thus recalls a well-known autobiography of a literary scholar who grew up in an Armenian-American family of survivors. This family story is reminiscent of many Holocaust survivors who wanted to put their awful past behind them in the immediate post-war era, only to have their second and third generation progeny dig it back up. What I'm saying is that silencing the past isn't necessarily always a bad thing. It can be an important coping mechanism. But of course, we're most concerned here with denialism that comes from the perpetrators and their descendants, who utilize many forms of denial. For example, there's the more blatant form of factual denial, as in saying that the Armenian genocide or whatever literally did not happen. There's also a more subtle form of interpretive denial. So like what happened to the Armenians wasn't genocide, it was war. It wasn't driven by irrational hatreds, but by the logic of military necessity. Then there's also the more nuanced form of implicatory denial, which is especially relevant for the descendants of perpetrators who may acknowledge the bad parts of history, but essentially wash their hands clean of any responsibility. These theories and concepts play out in Reading 2 this week, which examines how the so-called Armenian question has been variously covered in Turkish high school history textbooks over the past half-century. I direct your attention to this particular subsection towards the beginning of the essay, which discusses why the denial of the Armenian genocide has been such a fundamental part of Turkey's national identity. As you read this section, think about some of the theories and concepts that you've just been exposed to. So for example, how did this knowledge system become sedimented in the form of collective memory? And what integrative function does this system of denialism serve in the reproduction of modern Turkish national identity? Reading 2 then goes on to outline 4 distinct phases in the representation of the Armenian question in Turkish history textbooks over the course of nearly 60 years, beginning in 1950. One could argue that various forms of denial were deployed across these various phases. So even though the general gist of the narrative remained the same, i.e., Turkey remains innocent of genocide, the narrative structure or form has nevertheless mutated or adapted to changing circumstances. Towards the end of the essay, a number of domestic and international factors are identified as possible explanations for these narrative changes. Moving on to reading 3, yet sticking with this same general region of the world, you may recognize this author from week 1, when we read that article on Theodor Adorno. This author is very theoretically inclined, and therefore very much up my alley, but I don't want us to get swamped with theory this week, especially as we just started looking at real-world situations closer to the classroom. Plus we have a bit more theory to cover this week. As such, I really just want to focus on how educators and students may become so deeply invested in their group's collective memories of trauma, as well as the related norms that further crystallize the us versus them mentality underlying any given conflict, so much so that the conflict becomes intractable. For example, the author shares a personal account of experiencing war in his homeland, on the divided island of Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean. I'll spare you the details of the conflict, which you can see briefly outlined here. Suffice it to say that there's deeply ingrained antagonisms between Greeks and Turks, going back at least to the 19th century. The author experienced war as a young child. His grandfather was in fact forcibly expelled from his home in the north and found refuge in the Greek safe zone in the south. So obviously the author had first-hand experiences. He even recalls having nightmares as a young child about Turkish bombers. But apart from that, the author also recounts experiences in school that hardened this us versus them mentality. There's an especially noteworthy incident on this page, where the author recalls meeting a Turkish Cypriot for the first time while studying abroad in America. The author and this other student get into a verbal altercation, essentially going back and forth over who started the conflict, going all the way back to the 15th century Ottoman Empire. Later on, in reading 3, the author turns to focus on the positive, productive relationship that he forged with this other student, thereby opening up another discussion on the role of pedagogy in forging new solidarities that transcend the us-them divide without erasing identities and collective memories of trauma. Next week, when we cover conflict prevention, I'll come back to the positive role of education. But for now, I want to stay focused on the negative side, i.e. the process of socialization that led to this incident on page 8. As I ask it here, how did the author learn to hate the other? We turn to reading 4, which, for better or worse, brings some more theory and concepts to the table. The reading draws from a body of social and evolutionary psychology known as terror management theory to explore some of the fraught implications of teaching difficult knowledge. Now, the gist of the theory is that people adhere to cultural worldviews for psychological and ontological security in order to insulate us from the debilitating terror that comes with the self-awareness of our own mortality. So the idea is that by deeply investing in their in-group, people can become part of something bigger than themselves. By being part of society, individuals can leave behind a legacy that figuratively transcends their death. Now, when people's worldviews are challenged and their sense of ontological security is perceived to be threatened, they may actually end up clinging even more closely to these worldviews, sort of doubling down. More than that, they may be further inclined towards lashing out against those seen to be the source of such threats. Defensive reactions may range from accommodation and assimilation at one end to derogation and even annihilation at the other end. When thus faced with such existential angst, people may be more inclined towards prejudicial thinking against the other, opening the door to demagogues who effectively scapegoat the other as the source of evil or ill fortune. At its worst, this sort of glorified self-preservation instinct can end up endorsing genocide and other mass atrocities. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to go that far in terms of leading to genocide per se. For example, a real-world manifestation of terror management theory in education can be seen with the ongoing political debate over the role of critical race theory in schools, and the backlash it's provoked, especially from more conservative segments in the United States. I reference here another one of our recommended articles this week, although you could just turn on the news to see this issue, really. For example, the language quoted here comes from the 2022 so-called anti-woke law in Florida, which prohibits teachings that may result in students feeling any guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress supposedly due to learning about structural racism. I mean, if there is ever a need for reckoning with the psychoanalytic dimension to difficult knowledge, this would be it. Now, I'm not saying that conservative opponents of CRT are somehow stumbling down the slippery slope to Auschwitz. However, to the extent that this contestation over difficult knowledge has exacerbated identity-based social divisions, then it may indeed register as a risk factor for genocide, recalling our lesson from week 1. To bring it back to reading 4, the author stressed that teachers may want to refer to terror management theory to help attend to the existential angst that may come with confronting difficult knowledge, giving both students and teachers the thinking tools to anticipate such threat and defense cycles, thereby disarming the potential for manipulation by demagoguery. Honestly, I don't know how this works in practice. Hopefully this is something we can discuss on the discussion forum. Finally, reading 5 this week comes from an edited volume that's focused on the practical challenges involved with teaching difficult knowledge, especially in history classrooms. We thus have the concept of difficult histories, which the authors define as seen here. Note how they identify 3 necessary features to this concept: suffering, dehumanization, and injustice. They use the example of teaching American slavery to illustrate the distinctiveness of this concept. Most history lessons on American slavery tend to focus on the political debate surrounding the institution, culminating with the Emancipation Proclamation and the abolition of slavery. But such an approach doesn't make it quote-unquote difficult history, which would instead center and focus on the dehumanizing experiences and social suffering of enslaved peoples at the unjust hands of their masters and the political economic systems that upheld this especially cruel and fundamentally destructive institution. The authors note importantly that attention to resistance, rebellion, and survival in the face of such oppression should be a crucial part of the difficult history curriculum, but not at the expense of this more difficult or disturbing content. Now, such histories are especially difficult because they challenge the taken-for-granted knowledge that we are socialized with as young learners. Unlike the academic discipline of history, which now largely views history as constructed and socially and culturally situated, the history that appears in primary and secondary schools in many countries is still often presented as static and objective. After all, the traditional purpose of history education especially was to help forge national identities. More than any other subject, history promised a shared vision of a cohesive national past for generations of citizens, thereby helping to construct the imagined community that defines the nation. This traditional focus is at odds with the more contemporary urge to use history as part of larger struggles for social justice, the latter of which embraces the turn to difficult history. Instead, this traditional approach to history, especially at the primary and secondary levels, contributes to what I described earlier as the sedimentation of knowledge, helping to cement official narratives of the past that effectively serve to reinforce hegemonic structures or unequal power relations in society. Okay, at the risk of ending rather abruptly, I'm going to stop here. As usual, we have our weekly discussion forum assignment. However, by the end of the week, I also need you to email me about your final project. Remember, you have 2 options. First, you can write a 15 to 20 page research paper on a topic of your choosing, so long as it generally pertains to genocide education. The second option is to design a 10 to 15 page lesson plan that applies some of the theories and methods in this course. So just let me know via email, and reach out to me with any questions, ideas, or concerns. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.